Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Shenandoah County, Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1851, and the rolling hills of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley concealed secrets that would remain buried for over a century. Nestled between the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountains, the small settlement of Woodstock was known for its tranquility and the devout nature of its inhabitants. Among the town's most respected citizens was Eleanor Blackwood, a widow of considerable means who had inherited her husband's estate following his untimely death in 1847. The Blackwood plantation, Ravenscroft, sat on over 200 acres of fertile land approximately 3 miles east of Woodstock proper and was known throughout the county for its prosperity and the piety of its mistress. Eleanor Blackwood was, by all accounts, a pillar of the community. Following the death of her husband, Colonel James Blackwood, she had taken to charitable works with a fervor that impressed even the most dedicated members of the local Presbyterian congregation. It was her donation of both land and funds that allowed for the construction of what would come to be known as Mercy Chapel, a small but elegant stone structure built at the edge of her property in 1849. Eleanor insisted that the chapel be constructed away from the main house at the border of dense woodland that marked the eastern boundary of Ravenscroft, so that those seeking God's mercy might find it in the peace of his natural cathedral, she was quoted as saying in a Woodstock Sentinel article dated May 17, 1849. What made Mercy Chapel unusual was not its location, but rather Eleanor's insistence that she personally oversee every aspect of its construction. According to the Journal of Reverend Thomas Whitaker, the Presbyterian minister who would later preside over services at the chapel, Eleanor dismissed 3 different stonemasons during the building process for reasons she declined to specify. The first, a Mr. Harlan from Winchester, was dismissed after questioning the unusual specifications for the chapel floor. The second, Joseph Miller of Strasburg, lasted only 2 weeks before being paid and sent away. The third, William Cooper, a highly respected craftsman from as far away as Richmond, departed abruptly one night, leaving behind his tools and collecting his payment from Eleanor's estate manager the following week. When the estate manager inquired as to the reason for Cooper's sudden departure, Eleanor merely stated that his vision for the Lord's house did not align with mine. The construction, which should have been completed in 4 months, stretched to nearly a year. When questioned about the delay by concerned members of the congregation, Eleanor would smile thinly and remind them that perfection in God's house cannot be rushed. Throughout this period, Eleanor was observed making frequent trips to the construction site, often at unusual hours. Martha Simmons, whose farm adjoined the eastern edge of Ravenscroft, reported seeing lantern light at the chapel site well past midnight on several occasions during the winter of 1849. When Mercy Chapel was finally dedicated in April of 1850, it quickly became a point of pride for the community. Its hand-carved pews, stained glass windows imported from Philadelphia, and particularly its ornate altar, carved from a single piece of Virginia oak, were considered remarkable for a chapel of its modest size. Eleanor had commissioned the altar herself, and according to Reverend Whitaker's journal, had been most particular about its dimensions. Mrs. Blackwood insists the altar must be no less than 6 feet in depth, he wrote, an unusual request, as most altars of comparable chapels rarely exceed 4. Even more unusual was her insistence that the altar be immovable, secured to the floor by means of iron bolts that extended deep into the stone foundation. When Reverend Whitaker questioned this decision, suggesting that occasionally moving the altar might be necessary for cleaning or maintenance, Eleanor was adamant. The altar represents the immovable presence of God, she reportedly stated, and shall not be disturbed under any circumstances. The dedication of Mercy Chapel coincided with another notable change at Ravenscroft Plantation. In the months leading up to the chapel's completion, Eleanor had sold or transferred nearly half of the 28 slaves who worked her lands. According to county records, 14 slaves were sold to plantations as far away as Georgia, while Eleanor retained primarily those who worked in her household. When questioned about this decision by her brother-in-law, William Blackwood, who expressed concern about how she would maintain the plantation's productivity, Eleanor reportedly stated that she had found a more efficient means of managing the estate's affairs. William, who had never approved of Eleanor's inheritance of his brother's estate, a decision that had caused considerable friction within the family, became increasingly suspicious of his sister-in-law's activities. In a letter to his cousin in Richmond, dated June 18, 1850, William wrote, "Eleanor's behavior grows more peculiar by the day. She has divested herself of nearly half the property's workforce, yet claims the plantation's productivity will not suffer. When I pressed her on the matter, she spoke vaguely of mechanical innovations and modern farming techniques. Yet I have observed no new equipment arriving at Ravenscroft, nor any evidence of these supposed improvements. More disturbing still is her obsession with that chapel. She visits it at all hours, carrying baskets and parcels, the contents of which she refuses to discuss. I fear the loss of James may have affected her mind more severely than we initially supposed." The years 1850 to 1851 marked a period of unusual quiet at Ravenscroft. Eleanor, who had previously been known for hosting frequent gatherings of Woodstock's elite, became increasingly reclusive. She attended Sunday services at Mercy Chapel without fail, always arriving precisely 5 minutes before the service began, and departing immediately afterward, declining invitations to Sunday dinner or other social engagements. Those who called upon her at Ravenscroft were politely but firmly turned away by her housemaid Abigail, with apologies that the mistress is indisposed and cannot receive visitors at present. During this period, Eleanor's appearance began to change noticeably. Always slender, she grew gaunt, her skin taking on a pallid quality that many attributed to grief or perhaps illness. Her once immaculate attire became less so, with observers noting crumbs of soil on her skirts and occasionally dried leaves in her hair. Reverend Whitaker, in an entry dated November 1850, expressed concern. "Mrs. Blackwood's decline is apparent to all who see her. When I suggested she might consult Dr. Merriweather about her health, she laughed in a manner I found quite disturbing and said, 'It is not my body that ails me, Reverend, but my conscience.' When pressed further, she would say only that she was engaged in a work of great spiritual significance that demanded all her energy. It was during this period that the first whispers began. Nancy Miller, whose husband's farm bordered Ravenscroft to the north, reported to several friends that she had heard strange sounds coming from the direction of Mercy Chapel late at night. Not singing, she would later tell a county investigator, but a low moaning like souls in torment. When her husband suggested they investigate, Nancy refused, saying that there was something not right about that place after dark. Thomas Miller, Nancy's husband, was less inclined to superstition. On a night in December 1850, after hearing the strange sounds his wife had described, he took his hunting rifle and walked the half-mile to Mercy Chapel. According to his subsequent statement to authorities, as he approached the chapel, the sounds ceased abruptly. The chapel appeared dark and empty. However, as Miller circled the building, he observed a faint light emanating from what appeared to be a small opening in the ground near the chapel's eastern wall. As he moved closer to investigate, he heard a sharp whistle from the direction of the woods. Turning toward the sound, he glimpsed what he described as a tall figure in dark clothing standing at the edge of the tree line. Before Miller could approach or call out, the figure retreated into the forest. Unnerved, Miller returned home, telling only his wife of what he had seen. "I didn't like the feel of it," he later explained. "Felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see." Sarah Jenkins, who served as Eleanor's cook, left her position abruptly in October of 1850. When pressed by curious neighbors about her sudden departure, Sarah would only say that she could not abide the things happening at Ravenscroft. She refused to elaborate further, and within a month had relocated to her sister's home in Winchester, some 30 miles away. It was not until 1857, well after the events at Mercy Chapel had come to light, that Sarah Jenkins provided a written account of her experiences at Ravenscroft during Eleanor Blackwood's final year. In this document, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, Jenkins described how Eleanor's eating habits had changed dramatically in the months following the chapel's completion. When I asked who this food was for, she told me it was for those who labor in God's vineyard. Each evening, she would have me pack these provisions into baskets, which she then carried away herself, always in the direction of the chapel. Jenkins also described discovering strange items among Eleanor's possessions: bandages, salves typically used for treating wounds and sores, crude hand-drawn maps of the surrounding countryside, and on one occasion, a man's shirt stained with what appeared to be blood. She ate barely enough to keep a bird alive, Jenkins wrote, but ordered me to prepare vast quantities of food each day: cornbread, salt pork, simple stews, and the like. When Jenkins questioned these findings, Eleanor dismissed her concerns, saying that the items were part of my charitable work among the unfortunate. Perhaps most disturbing were the observations of Jeremiah Wallace, an elderly free black man who occasionally performed odd jobs around Woodstock. In a deposition given years later, Wallace stated that he had been hired to clear brush near the chapel in the summer of 1851 and had observed Eleanor approaching the chapel well after midnight carrying what appeared to be a basket covered with cloth. She didn't see me on account of I was sleeping under the old oak by the creek, Wallace's statement reads, but I saw her plain as day in the moonlight. She went inside carrying that basket and didn't come out again for near an hour. When she did, the basket looked lighter. Wallace further stated that on 3 separate occasions he observed Eleanor meeting with a man near the chapel after dark. He described the man as tall and lean, with a beard that reached to the middle of his chest. Wallace could not hear their conversations, but noted that on each occasion Eleanor passed something to the man, papers or small parcels. The man would then depart on horseback, always heading north. Wallace, wary of involving himself in the affairs of white landowners, shared his observations with no one until after Eleanor's death. The events that would ultimately expose the true nature of Mercy Chapel began on September 12, 1851. A severe thunderstorm swept through the Shenandoah Valley, causing considerable damage throughout the region. Lightning strikes were reported at several locations, including the courthouse in Woodstock and 2 residential properties. Mercy Chapel was also struck, the lightning bolt hitting the cross atop the bell tower and traveling down into the structure, damaging the roof and starting a small fire that was quickly extinguished by the subsequent downpour. The following morning, Reverend Whitaker arrived to assess the damage and determine what repairs would be necessary. According to his journal entry dated September 13, 1851, he found Eleanor already there, in a state of considerable agitation. Her normally carefully arranged hair was disheveled, her dress damp and mud-stained, suggesting she had been at the chapel since the previous night, possibly throughout the storm. Upon my arrival at the chapel, Whitaker wrote, I found Mrs. Blackwood attempting to prevent water from seeping through the damaged roof by placing buckets and cloths beneath the worst of the leaks. Her concern seemed disproportionate to the damage, which, while regrettable, was far from catastrophic. When I suggested that we might move the altar to protect it from water damage, she became most adamant that it not be disturbed, stating that its placement had been consecrated and must not be altered under any circumstances. Reverend Whitaker, though puzzled by Eleanor's vehemence, agreed to leave the altar in place. He departed shortly thereafter to arrange for a carpenter and roofer to make the necessary repairs. Eleanor insisted that all work be delayed until she could be present to supervise, citing concern for the chapel's sacred artifacts. When Whitaker pointed out that the continuing rain might cause further damage if repairs were delayed, Eleanor reluctantly agreed to allow work to proceed the following day. but emphasized repeatedly that no one was to enter the chapel before her arrival. The repairs were scheduled for September 15th, 2 days after the storm. According to the account of Thomas Harwood, the carpenter hired to repair the roof, Eleanor arrived at the chapel before dawn and remained throughout the day, watching the work with an intensity that made him uneasy. She never took her eyes off that altar, Harwood later testified. Even when we were working on the roof, she kept glancing at it, as if she feared it might somehow disappear if she looked away too long. By late afternoon, most of the repairs had been completed, and Harwood and his assistant prepared to leave. It was then that they heard a sound that Harwood would later describe as a faint tapping, like someone knocking on wood from very far away. Eleanor, too, heard the sound and, according to Harwood, went white as a sheet. She quickly dismissed the men, insisting that she would finish the final minor repairs herself and pressing additional payment into Harwood's hands to hasten their departure. Harwood's assistant, a young man named Frederick Mueller, would later claim that as they were leaving, he glanced back through the chapel window and observed Eleanor kneeling before the altar, pressing her ear to the floor as if listening for something. This claim was disputed by Harwood, who maintained that they departed immediately upon being dismissed and observed no such behavior. Harwood and his assistant left, but the carpenter remained troubled by Eleanor's behavior. On their way back to Woodstock, they encountered Reverend Whitaker on the road and shared their concerns. The Reverend, already disquieted by Eleanor's earlier behavior, decided to return to the chapel. What happened next was documented in Whitaker's journal in entries so disturbing that they were later sealed by court order and not made public until 1963, when historian Margaret Collins was granted access to the documents for her scholarly work on antebellum Virginia. According to Whitaker, he arrived at Mercy Chapel to find the door ajar. Upon entering, he observed Eleanor kneeling before the altar, speaking in low, urgent tones. She did not notice his presence immediately, allowing him to overhear her words. "You must be silent. For the love of God, you must remain silent. I cannot help you if they discover you." When Eleanor became aware of Whitaker's presence, she rose quickly, smoothing her skirts and composing her features. She explained that she had been praying for guidance following the damage to the chapel. Whitaker, increasingly suspicious, nodded and moved closer to the altar. Noticing that Eleanor shifted subtly to remain between him and the heavy oak structure. It was then that both heard it clearly, a muffled cough, unmistakably human, emanating from beneath the altar itself. Whitaker's journal entry continues, "I demanded to know what manner of deception was being practiced in God's house." Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked entirely. At this point, she fell to her knees, clutching at my coat, begging me to understand that she had only done what necessity demanded. I pulled away from her grasp and approached the altar, where I now discerned a thin seam in the wooden floor beneath it, suggesting a trap door of some kind. As I moved to investigate further, Mrs. Blackwood's pleas became hysterical. "You cannot open it," she cried. "They are not ready. The passages are not completed." Despite Eleanor's protests, Reverend Whitaker moved the altar carpet aside and discovered a cleverly concealed trap door. The mechanism was ingenious, a series of counterweights and hidden hinges that allowed the heavy door to be lifted with minimal effort once one knew its secret. Upon opening it, he was confronted with a sight that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Below the chapel floor was a shallow space approximately 4 feet in height, extending beneath the entire chapel. The area was dimly lit by a single oil lamp that cast long, grotesque shadows across the earthen walls. The air was thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, waste, and disease. In this dark, confined space were 11 people, 7 men and 4 women, lying on thin pallets. They were clearly slaves, though none bore the brand of the Blackwood plantation. All showed signs of malnourishment and prolonged confinement in a space without adequate light or ventilation. One man, who would later identify himself as Samuel, explained in a weak voice that they were runaways from plantations in North Carolina and southern Virginia. They had been promised passage to Pennsylvania and freedom by a man who had delivered them to Eleanor Blackwood instead. Eleanor had kept them confined beneath the chapel floor for months, bringing food and water only every few days, always promising that the time for your journey north will come soon. According to Whitaker's account, a narrow tunnel had been begun from the space beneath the chapel, extending northward, presumably intended to connect with a nearby creek that fed into the Shenandoah River. The tunnel was crude and incomplete, extending only about 30 feet before ending abruptly. Tools for digging, shovels, picks, even crude implements fashioned from pieces of wood, lay scattered about, suggesting that the imprisoned people had been engaged in excavating the tunnel themselves. More disturbing still were the conditions under which these individuals had been kept. The space beneath the chapel floor was divided into crude cells by wooden partitions. Each cell contained a thin pallet for sleeping and a bucket for waste. The only ventilation came from small air holes drilled through the chapel floor and concealed beneath the pews above. These holes, Whitaker noted, had been positioned to align with decorative elements in the chapel flooring, rendering them virtually invisible to casual observation. Among the possessions found in the underground space were several religious texts, including a Bible with certain passages marked, primarily those relating to slavery and liberation. Also discovered were letters, apparently written by Eleanor, addressed to contacts in Philadelphia and New York. These letters, dated throughout 1850 and early 1851, spoke vaguely of packages to be delivered and arrangements to be made. None had been sent. They remained sealed and addressed, suggesting that Eleanor's promised communications with Underground Railroad operatives further north had never actually occurred. Reverend Whitaker immediately sent for the local sheriff, Jonathan Pierce, who arrived with 2 deputies within the hour. Eleanor was taken into custody that evening, offering no resistance and making no attempt to justify or explain her actions. She was held in the Woodstock jail pending investigation, but never stood trial. On the morning of September 18, 1851, she was found dead in her cell, having ingested a poison that she had apparently concealed on her person. A note found in her possession read only, "I sought to serve both God and man, and failed them both." An inquest into Eleanor's death revealed that the poison she had used was a tincture of nightshade, commonly used in small doses as a sleep aid, but lethal in larger quantities. The local physician, Dr. Merriweather, testified that death would have been relatively painless, a gradual slowing of the heart leading to unconsciousness and, ultimately, cardiac arrest. How Eleanor came to possess the poison while in custody was never determined, though suspicion fell on Abigail, her housemaid, who had been permitted to bring Eleanor clean clothing during her confinement. The 11 individuals found beneath Mercy Chapel were taken to the Woodstock courthouse, where their status became the subject of considerable debate. Under the recently strengthened Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they should have been returned to their owners. However, no clear documentation of ownership could be established for any of them. Several local physicians testified that their health had been so severely compromised by their confinement that they would likely not survive a journey south. In what was considered a surprising decision, Judge Henry Montrose ruled that the 11 would be remanded to the care of the Presbyterian Church until their health was restored, at which time their cases would be reviewed individually. Church records suggest that all 11 were quietly transported north within weeks of the ruling, presumably to freedom in Canada, though no formal documentation of this outcome exists in county or church archives. The aftermath of the Mercy Chapel incident sent shock waves through the community of Woodstock and beyond. Local newspapers initially reported the story as a shocking crime, a respected widow harboring fugitive slaves in violation of federal law. The Richmond Enquirer ran a front-page article on September 20, 1851, under the headline, "Virginian Lady's Betrayal, Mercy Chapel Conceals Fugitives." The article described Eleanor as a woman of previously unblemished reputation, who had succumbed to abolitionist sentiment and betrayed both her late husband's legacy and the laws of Virginia. Northern newspapers, by contrast, portrayed the incident quite differently. The Philadelphia Inquirer's account, published September 25, 1851, described Eleanor as a woman of conscience caught between competing moral imperatives and questioned the justice of laws that would criminalize acts of basic human mercy. This characterization was vehemently disputed by Southern publications, leading to a heated exchange of editorials that continued for several weeks. In Woodstock itself, opinion was sharply divided. Many community members, particularly those with significant slaveholdings, condemned Eleanor's actions as treasonous. Others, including some members of her Presbyterian congregation, expressed sympathy for her moral dilemma while stopping short of endorsing her solution. Reverend Whitaker, caught in the middle of this controversy, maintained a careful neutrality in public, though his private journal entries suggest he was deeply conflicted about the incident. "I cannot condone Mrs. Blackwood's deception," he wrote on October 3, 1851, "nor the suffering she inflicted upon those she claimed to help. Yet I find myself wondering if, had she approached me with her moral qualms, I might have offered better counsel than that which led her down this dark path. The Lord commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves, but how are we to reconcile this with laws that declare some neighbors property of others? I pray for guidance in these troubled times." Mercy Chapel was deconsecrated and abandoned following these events. By 1853, local accounts indicate that it had already begun to fall into disrepair. No efforts were made to restore or maintain it, and by 1870 little remained but the stone foundation and portions of the walls. The land on which it stood was eventually incorporated into the neighboring Miller Farm, the chapel ruins serving as a quiet reminder of a community's darkest chapter. The Blackwood estate, Ravenscroft, fared little better. With no direct heir, Eleanor and James had been childless. The property passed to William Blackwood, who had little interest in maintaining it. He sold most of the land to neighboring farmers and the main house to a merchant from Winchester, who subsequently converted it into a small inn. The establishment, ironically named Blackwood Haven, operated until 1883, when it was destroyed by fire. Today, nothing remains of Ravenscroft but a small cemetery where James Blackwood is buried. Eleanor's grave, if it exists, is unmarked. The true motivations behind Eleanor Blackwood's actions have been the subject of historical debate for decades. Some scholars, including Margaret Collins, suggest that Eleanor may have initially intended to help the runaways escape to freedom, but became paralyzed by fear of discovery after the passage of the stricter Fugitive Slave Act. According to this theory, Eleanor genuinely believed she was protecting the fugitives by keeping them hidden beneath the chapel, while she sought a safe route north, but lacked the courage or resources to complete the journey. Others, like historian James Thornton, argue that Eleanor was simply deranged, perhaps driven to madness by isolation and the loss of her husband. In his 1957 work, Madness and Morality, Case Studies from the Antebellum South, Thornton suggests that Eleanor's religious fervor masked a deep psychological disturbance. Her creation of a literal underworld beneath the chapel, Thornton writes, represents a physical manifestation of her fractured psyche, a space where she could simultaneously play the roles of both slave owner and liberator, maintaining control while believing herself virtuous. A third theory emerged in 1968 when the Blackwood family papers were donated to the Virginia Historical Society. Among these documents was a series of letters between Eleanor and her sister in Philadelphia, in which Eleanor expressed growing moral qualms about slavery following her husband's death. In one letter dated January 1848, she wrote, "James always insisted that the peculiar institution was ordained by God. But I find myself increasingly unable to reconcile the ownership of souls with Christ's teachings. Yet I cannot simply free those who depend upon me without ensuring their safety, nor can I continue as I have been, complicit in a system I have come to abhor." These letters suggest that Eleanor may have initially conceived of Mercy Chapel as a way station on the Underground Railroad, a temporary hiding place for runaways en route to freedom in the North. What remains unclear is why she kept 11 people confined in such inhumane conditions for months, rather than facilitating their journey northward. One possible explanation came to light in 1972 when a journal believed to have belonged to the mysterious bearded man observed meeting with Eleanor was discovered in a Pennsylvania archive. The journal, attributed to one Jeremiah Colson, described him as an Underground Railroad conductor active in the Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania corridor from 1845 to 1853. Entries for 1850-1851 reference the widow's station and express frustration with delays and complications. An entry dated March 17, 1851 reads, "Another visit to the widow's station. She grows more fearful with each passing day. The packages remain where they were deposited months ago, despite my assurances that the northern route remains open. I begin to suspect that fear has overcome her initial conviction. She speaks now of waiting for a sign from God before proceeding. I reminded her that the suffering of his children might be sign enough, but she remains unmoved. I depart again empty-handed, with heavy heart." If this account is accurate, it suggests that Eleanor, initially committed to aiding escaped slaves, became increasingly paralyzed by fear as the reality of the risks involved became apparent. Rather than either releasing her charges or completing their journey to freedom, she kept them in a liminal state, neither slaves nor truly free, while she wrestled with her conscience. The most disturbing theory was proposed by forensic psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Mayhew in her 1965 analysis of the case. Based on Eleanor's reported behavior, her increasing reclusiveness, and particularly her suicide note, Mayhew suggested that Eleanor may have suffered from a form of moral compartmentalization. She created a physical manifestation of her psychological state, Mayhew wrote. By literally hiding them beneath a place of worship, she enacted a perverse form of penance, neither freeing them nor treating them as property, but keeping them suspended in a liminal state that reflected her own ethical paralysis. Mayhew further speculated that Eleanor's provision of religious texts to her captives might indicate a grotesque attempt at salvation through suffering, a belief that their confinement represented a form of spiritual trial that would ultimately lead to both physical and spiritual freedom. Above ground was the pious Christian woman, generous benefactor, and respected community member. Below ground were the human beings whose very existence represented her moral compromise. In her distorted thinking, Mayhew wrote, she may have cast herself not as jailer, but as spiritual guide, leading her charges through a dark night of the soul toward an eventual redemption. This interpretation gained additional support in 1978, when analysis of soil samples taken from the chapel site revealed traces of laudanum, suggesting that Eleanor may have been sedating her captives to ensure their continued compliance. Whether this was done out of fear of discovery or as part of a misguided spiritual program remains unknown. The fate of the 11 individuals found beneath Mercy Chapel has been the subject of considerable historical investigation. Church records confirm that all 11 were initially housed in the Presbyterian Church's poorhouse, where they received medical attention and basic necessities. Their names, as recorded by Reverend Whitaker, were Samuel, Ruth, Moses, Hannah, Elijah, Leah, Isaac, Deborah, Aaron, Miriam, and Daniel. Of these 11, the subsequent lives of only 3 can be traced with any certainty. Samuel, identified in later documents as Samuel Johnson, appears in the 1861 census of Ontario, Canada, listed as a carpenter with a wife and 2 daughters. A memoir published in Toronto in 1875, titled From Bondage to Freedom, A Virginia Slave's Journey, is attributed to a Samuel Johnson and contains a brief account of confinement beneath a chapel, though it differs in some details from the historical record. Deborah, who adopted the surname Freeman, is mentioned in Philadelphia Quaker records from 1853 to 1867 as a domestic servant and later as a seamstress. She apparently married in 1855 and had 3 children, all of whom received education through Quaker-sponsored schools. Her obituary, published in a Philadelphia newspaper in 1889, makes no mention of her early life in Virginia or her time beneath Mercy Chapel. Daniel, who took the name Daniel Hope, appears in several abolitionist publications in the late 1850s, where he is described as a powerful speaker who shared his experiences of slavery and escape with Northern audiences. According to these accounts, Hope was particularly effective at conveying the psychological toll of his confinement beneath the chapel, describing it as a living death where we existed as neither slave nor free, but as ghosts caught between worlds. Hope reportedly returned to Virginia after the Civil War to search for family members sold away during his youth, but no record of this journey's outcome has been found. The site where Mercy Chapel once stood is now part of the Shenandoah National Park. Nothing remains of the structure itself, though occasional hikers report finding scattered stones that may once have been part of its foundation. In 1969, a small plaque was placed near the site, commemorating the 11 individuals who survived their ordeal beneath the altar. Their names, as recorded by Reverend Whitaker, are listed simply without comment. Perhaps most unsettling are the claims, never officially verified, that at certain times of year, particularly around the anniversary of the chapel's discovery, the sound of tapping can be heard emanating from the ground where the altar once stood. Park rangers dismiss these reports as likely the work of woodpeckers or other wildlife, but some locals remain convinced that something of the chapel's dark history lingers at the site. Local folklore has expanded upon this notion, with stories of visitors to the site experiencing sudden feelings of claustrophobia or hearing whispered voices when no one is present. In 1985, a group of college students camping near the former chapel site reported waking in the night to find their tents surrounded by tall, thin figures that disappeared when approached. Park authorities attributed this sighting to sleep deprivation and suggestion, noting that the students had visited the site specifically because of its reputation for being haunted. The case of Virginia's Forbidden Chapel stands as a testament to the complex moral landscape of antebellum America, where individual conscience collided with societal norms and legal structures. It reminds us that horror often resides not in supernatural phenomena, but in the choices made by ordinary people caught between competing moral imperatives. As historian Margaret Collins wrote in her conclusion to The Mercy Chapel Incident, Moral Ambiguity in Antebellum Virginia, published in 1964, the true terror of Eleanor Blackwood's story lies not in what she did, but in the fact that she believed herself to be acting righteously. The altar of Mercy Chapel concealed not only 11 human beings denied their freedom and dignity, but also the profound moral confusion of a society that could not reconcile its professed Christian values with its economic dependence on human bondage. The last known photograph of the chapel ruins, taken in 1927 before the establishment of the national park, shows little more than a jumble of moss-covered stones partially reclaimed by the forest. Yet the site continues to draw those fascinated by its history. Park records indicate that small offerings, flowers, coins, occasionally written notes, are periodically found at the location, left by visitors moved by the story of those who spent months in darkness, waiting for a freedom that seemed always just beyond reach. In 2005, an archaeological survey of the site revealed additional details about the underground chamber. Ground-penetrating radar identified the full extent of the space beneath where the chapel had stood, confirming Reverend Whitaker's description of a room extending beneath the entire structure. Excavation also uncovered several artifacts: a woman's hairpin believed to have belonged to Eleanor, fragments of pottery consistent with food storage, a button carved from bone, and, most poignantly, a small wooden cross, crudely fashioned from 2 sticks bound with string, found buried in what would have been the farthest corner from the entrance to the underground space. The Journal of Samuel, one of the 11 survivors, was discovered in a Philadelphia archive in 1972. His account of the months spent beneath Mercy Chapel is sparse but revealing. The mistress would come at night, he wrote, bringing food and water, sometimes reading from Scripture. She spoke of a tunnel that would lead to freedom, but each week the tunnel grew only inches, if at all. We began to understand that we were neither slaves nor free, but something in between, buried alive in the space between intention and action. Samuel's journal also describes the psychological impact of prolonged confinement in the dark, cramped space. Time loses all meaning in the dark. Days and nights blur together. We mark time by the mistress's visits, by the sounds of worship above our heads on Sundays, by the small victories of extending our tunnel another foot toward freedom. Some days I believe we will escape this purgatory. Other days I fear we have already died, and this is our eternal punishment for seeking that which others did not wish us to have. Most disturbing is Samuel's description of Eleanor's changing behavior over time. When first we came here, the mistress spoke of weeks, perhaps a month before our journey north would continue. Her eyes were bright then, her manner resolute. As weeks became months, a change came over her. Her visits grew less frequent, her manner distracted. She speaks now of visions and signs, of waiting for divine guidance. I fear her God speaks a different language than our own, for our prayers for freedom go unanswered while she claims to await heavenly instruction. The journal ends abruptly in early September 1851, just days before the discovery of the underground chamber. The final entry reads simply, "A great storm last night. Water seeps through our ceiling. The mistress came today, more agitated than I have ever seen her. She speaks of danger, of discovery. Perhaps at last something will change, for better or worse. I pray for deliverance in whatever form it may come." In the end, the story of Virginia's Forbidden Chapel is not one of ghosts or supernatural horrors, but of the quiet terror of moral compromise, of good intentions corrupted, and of human beings reduced to shadows beneath the floorboards of piety. It is a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing stories are those that reveal not what lurks beyond the boundaries of human experience, but what lies hidden within the human heart. The case of Eleanor Blackwood and Mercy Chapel has been the subject of numerous academic studies, particularly in recent decades as scholars have increasingly focused on the moral complexities of the antebellum period. In 1992, historian Rebecca Harrington published The Architecture of Concealment: Hidden Spaces in Antebellum America, which placed the Mercy Chapel incident in the context of other structures designed to hide fugitive slaves. What distinguishes the Mercy Chapel case, Harrington wrote, is not the existence of a hiding place, as such spaces were relatively common along established underground railroad routes, but rather the perversion of purpose. Typical safe houses were designed for temporary concealment, with clear protocols for moving individuals northward as quickly as possible. Mercy Chapel, by contrast, became a prison rather than a way station, its occupants trapped in a liminal space that mimicked freedom without providing it. Harrington's analysis suggested that Eleanor's actions represented an extreme manifestation of a common moral failing among well-meaning whites who opposed slavery: the tendency to prioritize their own comfort and safety over the actual liberation of those they claimed to help. By creating an elaborate underground chamber complete with religious texts and the promise of eventual freedom, Harrington argued, Eleanor could maintain the self-image of liberator without assuming the risks that actual liberation entailed. Further insight into Eleanor's psychological state came in 1998, when a previously unknown diary of hers was discovered in the attic of a house in Winchester, Virginia, apparently having been removed from Ravenscroft by Abigail, her housemaid, following Eleanor's death. The diary, covering the period from January 1850 to August 1851, provides disturbing glimpses into Eleanor's increasingly fractured mental state. Early entries express clear moral opposition to slavery and a determination to act on these convictions. "I can no longer bear to profit from the suffering of others," she wrote on February 3, 1850. James would not understand, but I believe God has laid upon my heart a mission of mercy. The chapel will serve his purpose in ways the congregation cannot imagine. By June 1850, however, the tone of the entries had shifted significantly. "The conductor brought 3 more last night," she wrote. "The space grows crowded, but I dare not send them onward yet. The patrols have been increased along the northern routes. We must wait for safer times. They understand the necessity of patience. I read to them from Job today, of his trials and his ultimate deliverance." By early 1851, Eleanor's writings had taken on an increasingly messianic quality. "I dreamed last night that Christ himself appeared to me," an entry dated March 12th reads. "He stood before the altar and pointed downward, saying, 'What you do for the least of these, you do for me.' I awoke, understanding that their suffering is holy, a purification before deliverance. They are being prepared for a freedom more profound than mere physical liberation." The final entries are fragmented and often incoherent, suggesting a mind in severe distress. The last dated entry, August 30th, 1851, consists of a single sentence. "The voices beneath the floor have begun to blend with the voices in my head until I can no longer distinguish which speaks of damnation and which of salvation." The diary provides compelling evidence for Dr. Mayhew's theory of moral compartmentalization, suggesting that Eleanor had developed an elaborate theological justification for actions that, on some level, she recognized as harmful. By recasting the prolonged confinement as a form of spiritual preparation, she could maintain her self-image as rescuer rather than jailer. A 2010 forensic analysis of the diary by Dr. Jonathan Mercer, a specialist in historical psychology, concluded that Eleanor likely suffered from what would now be diagnosed as delusional disorder with religious preoccupation. "The progression evident in her writings," Mercer wrote, "suggests an initial moral conflict that, unable to be resolved through direct action due to fear or other limitations, was gradually transformed into a delusional system in which harmful actions were reinterpreted as beneficial and even divinely ordained." The discovery of additional documentation related to the Mercy Chapel incident has continued into recent years. In 2012, a collection of letters between Reverend Whitaker and his superiors in the Presbyterian hierarchy was found during renovation of a church in Philadelphia. These letters, written in the months following the discovery of the underground chamber, revealed the church's struggle to reconcile its official condemnation of Eleanor's deception with its unofficial support of abolitionist principles. In one particularly revealing letter, dated October 10, 1851, Whitaker's superior, Reverend Josiah Pemberton, wrote, "While we cannot publicly endorse Mrs. Blackwood's methods, which caused considerable suffering to those she purported to help, neither can we in good conscience condemn her underlying moral impulse. The Church finds itself in the uncomfortable position of navigating between what is legal and what is right, a position that many of our Virginia brethren know all too well. I trust your discretion in managing this delicate situation and ensuring that those poor souls found beneath the chapel floor find their way to safer harbor, without unduly implicating the Church in what the authorities would deem illegal activity." This correspondence suggests that despite public condemnation of Eleanor's actions, there existed a tacit understanding among certain church officials that the ultimate goal of helping the 11 escape to freedom was morally justified, even if her methods were not. The story of Virginia's Forbidden Chapel continues to resonate in contemporary discussions of moral complexity and the human capacity for self-deception. In her 2018 essay, The Mercy Paradox: Cruelty in the Name of Compassion, ethicist Dr. Amara Johnson draws parallels between Eleanor's actions and modern instances of humanitarian interventions that, despite good intentions, sometimes cause harm to those they aim to help. Eleanor Blackwood's tragedy, Johnson writes, lies in her inability to recognize that her actions, born of genuine moral concern, had become their own form of oppression. The slaves beneath her chapel floor exchanged one form of bondage for another, their physical needs minimally met, while their autonomy remained severely restricted. In her mind, she was their savior. In reality, she had become yet another controller of their destiny, deciding for them what form their journey to freedom should take and at what pace it should proceed. The physical traces of Mercy Chapel have largely disappeared from the Virginia landscape, reclaimed by forest and time. Yet the story continues to be told, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the complexities of moral action and the dangers of righteousness untempered by humility. In 2015, descendants of Samuel Johnson gathered at the chapel site for a small ceremony commemorating the resilience of their ancestor and the others who survived months of confinement beneath the altar. Among them was Dr. Eliza Johnson, Samuel's great-great-granddaughter and a professor of American history at Howard University. In her remarks, preserved in park records, she offered perhaps the most balanced assessment of Eleanor Blackwood's legacy. We gather today not to condemn or to absolve, but to remember those who suffered in darkness, whose journey to freedom took them through a purgatory of another's making. To remember that moral clarity is often elusive, even to those who seek it most fervently, and to remember that good intentions, unaccompanied by wisdom, humility, and a willingness to truly see those we claim to help, can lead to harm as surely as malice. Eleanor Blackwood's story is not simply one of villainy or heroism, but of the perilous territory that lies between, where most of human history unfolds, in the shadowland of mixed motives and imperfect choices. A final note. In 1965, during renovation of the old Woodstock Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed compartment within a wall that contained a small wooden box. Inside was a single sheet of paper, apparently torn from Eleanor Blackwood's journal. The handwriting, verified as Eleanor's by comparison with other documents, contained just one paragraph. "I dreamed last night that I was buried beneath the chapel floor, and above me they walked and prayed and sang hymns, never hearing my cries. Is this to be my penance? To be forgotten beneath the feet of the righteous, as I have allowed others to be forgotten? God forgive me, for I have built my altar upon the bodies of his children and called it mercy." This haunting confession, perhaps written in Eleanor's final days, suggests that on some level she recognized the moral contradiction at the heart of her actions. Like the 11 souls trapped beneath her chapel floor, she too had become imprisoned, not by physical walls, but by the labyrinth of her own moral reasoning, trapped between competing conceptions of right and wrong, between action and paralysis, between the person she believed herself to be and the person her actions revealed. In the years since the discovery of the Mercy Chapel incident, several other cases of similar moral complexity have come to light across the antebellum South. Instances where well-meaning individuals, attempting to navigate the treacherous moral terrain of a slave society, caused harm even as they sought to do good. Yet few match the psychological intricacy and symbolic resonance of Eleanor Blackwood's chapel, with its literal stratification of virtue above and suffering below, separated by mere inches of wood, yet inhabiting entirely different moral universes. For those who visit the chapel site today, now marked only by a simple plaque and the occasional outline of foundation stones visible through the forest floor, the physical reality of what transpired there in 1851 can be difficult to imagine. The chapel, the trapdoor, the underground chamber, all have been reclaimed by time and nature. Yet the moral questions raised by Eleanor Blackwood's actions remain as relevant and challenging as ever, a testament to the enduring complexity of human conscience and the often blurry line between righteousness and self-righteousness, between mercy and its perversion. As visitors to the site often remark, The most unsettling aspect of the Mercy Chapel story is not what it reveals about the particular moral failings of a specific time and place, but rather what it suggests about the universal human capacity for self-deception, our ability to convince ourselves that we are serving others, even as we serve primarily our own need for moral validation. It is this aspect of the story that continues to resonate long after the physical traces of Virginia's Forbidden Chapel have disappeared from the landscape, leaving only whispers of what once occurred beneath the altar, in that shadowy space between intention and impact, between the mercy we proclaim and the mercy we provide.